Thank you for everyone who's joined us on this lovely Friday morning here in India, and afternoon for our lovely guest today, who I'll introduce in a bit. As with all the FAIR dialogues we have had so far, today's conversation also provides an alternative view to one of our most commonly asked concerns on this group, right? Which is, how can we make our democracy and governments work in a manner that they ought to? If you remember, Krish, a month back, he joined us for our second dialogue. He left us with his belief that in order to have a fairer world, all of us needs to collectively work towards ensuring a fairer democracy. The challenge, of course, is to bridge the gap between a government of elected representatives and the citizens who elect them. After that session, I, for one, started reading up about what our guest today has spent tremendous amounts of time on. That is the idea of citizens assemblies and how they are in a prime position to help bring a more representative form of decision-making to the forefront. And now, this is irrespective of whether the government of that particular country gives them the due credit or not, right? And at the end of the day, one way or the other, the voice of the people, if structured, does reach those in decision-making positions, as I said, in one way or the other. Dr. Sonia Randhawa, Sonia, has tremendous credentials, and which I'm sure all of you are aware of, all of you have read up about her. And they include being an expert on Southeast Asian history and media. And more intriguingly, as some of you have mentioned to me separately, as being one of the key advocates in this entire region of Southeast Asia for the freedom of expression and the importance of independent media. And I know that there is so much more that we can speak to her about that, but today, this conversation is not about that. This conversation is about all the work that she's been doing as one of the founders of Coalition of Everyone, as well as her work with the Sortition Foundation, where she's actively propagating participatory governance and providing belief to all those of us who question our capacity to make a change in the way that we are governed. All towards a better and fairer world, not just for a few, but for everyone. Sonia, thank you so much for agreeing to come to speak with all of us today. The ray of hope that you're about to provide us with has been eagerly sought by all of us, and we're really eager to hear what you have to say. For everyone else on this call, the usual decorum applies. Please do keep yourself on mute. Once Sonia has finished addressing us, please feel free to go to the participants option and raise your hand. You'll see that option there to raise hands in the participants window. I will, of course, be happy to call out to you to ask your questions. For others, if you'd prefer to put in your questions as part of chat, then as always, I will pick that up and then I will relay that across to Sonia for all of you. All right. Of course, if you do speak, unmute yourself before you speak, right? And keep yourself muted for the rest of the time. And the chat is active as well, so please feel free to continue to do so. With that, I think I have gone on for far too long. So Sonia, it's over to you. And as I said, we're very, very eager to hear what you have to say to us.
Right, I just hope that I can live up to that. What I'm going to do is I've got some slides. So let me just share my screen with you. So first of all, I'm in Melbourne, Australia. So I'd just like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal elders of the country that I'm on. I'm on Wurundjeri country. This was country that was never ceded. There was never a treaty. And I'd like to pay my respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for a bit and talk a little bit about how we could move to a system that gives more people like us, like whoever us might be, a chance to be part of the decision making that's part of a democracy. I hope that I can live up to the hype just now, but I'm looking forward to doing questions. So I'll do a presentation and then I'm going to do an exercise in sortition. I've got all your names in a little tin here and show you how the sortition actually works and then go to questions after that. So what I'm really going to be focusing on is the idea of replacing elections with random selection and why it works and some of the challenges that it places, but mainly why we want to do that in the first place. A little bit to begin with about the Sortition Foundation. It's a not-for-profit social enterprise with a mission to promote deliberative mini-public. So a mini-public is a smaller group of people that basically look like the population at large, however that population is defined. It was founded in Cambridge in the UK. We've recently started working in Australia. We've, in the last week, sent out invitations for a Citizens Climate Assembly in Hungary, which is, well, it's in Budapest, the capital, so that's quite exciting. We've also done some work with the East Belgian Standing Citizens Assembly that's been established there, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And we specialize in the recruitment aspect of a Citizens Assembly. As say, it's not-profit, it has a very horizontal structure, and we've been doing this sort of recruitment just for the last 2 years. I've only really started getting involved in Citizens Assemblies it's just over a year now that I've started researching and looking into this, but it's building on my personal background in, I studied politics as an undergraduate in the last century. So that's my personal background. To some extent, I have a feeling that speaking to people from India, this is kind of moot. You probably understand why we need to do things better. But it isn't just a problem in India, and it isn't just a problem in Australia or America, or it's an international problem that democracy is in crisis. I remember that when the 2018 survey was done, there were only a couple of rays of hope for democracy, really. And the two of them were Indonesia and Malaysia. And in the last few months, Malaysia has undergone a sort of soft coup where democracy is once again in decline. So if you have a look at the international statistics, freedom was, between the years 2001 to 2010, democracy declined in 105 countries and it improved in 61 countries. But the last decade has been even worse. I'm not looking forward to the statistics from 2011 to 2020, but certainly it's been declining since 2016. The Freedom House does surveys every year, and every year things seem to be getting worse. Now, what that means isn't that people that I don't like are getting into power, but it means, first of all, that the people who are getting in power and are decreasing the freedoms upon which democracy rests, even elected democracy. Freedom of the media, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, all of these freedoms are in decline. There's there's increasing intolerance for diversity, whether it's racial diversity, whether it's respect for the rights of refugees. These are decreasing internationally on all continents. And the quality of democracy is declining. I think that, speaking from an Australian perspective, you can see the disconnect probably most clearly on the issue of climate change, where around 60 to 80%, depending on who's done the survey, of Australians want action on the climate crisis. And yet the politicians say that they have a remit to increase the amount that's being invested in coal and fossil fuels. So there is this huge disconnect between what people want and what the elected representatives are delivering. And there's a number of systemic reasons that I'm going to go into for why that's the case. Let's say, I'm sure that in India, you're quite well aware of some of the reasons behind this. One of the reasons is that it takes resources to get elected. It takes money, it takes time, and it takes a certain amount of resilience, particularly if you're a woman, for example, or if you're from a minority, where you're standing for election as a person. I just before this was watching a clip from the New South Wales State Parliament where the health minister was attacking the leader of the opposition in very personalized, very gendered ways. And these are attacks which happen in almost every elected body that I've had the pleasure of witnessing. And partly because of that, partly because of the cost of getting elected, because of the dependence, even in countries where there are limits to how much you can spend on elections, on a party machinery, you find that the elected representatives do not look like the population. So this is from the UK, where you can see that on the left, sorry, I still don't know left and right, even at my age. On the left, you've got what the population of the United Kingdom looks like. And on the right, you've got what the elected officials in the United Kingdom look like. So you can see they're a lot older, they are a lot more male. 90% of them are university educated compared to 20% of the population. 7% of the population is privately educated, whereas 33% of the people in Parliament are privately educated. So what you can see here is just the big difference between the wealth, the background and everything of the people in Parliament in the UK compared to the general population. Much older, much maler, much better educated in terms of having had a university education. But that means that there is a lot of other experiences in life that obviously they haven't had. So I think that that's one of the reasons why there's such a big disconnect between what people want and what politicians deliver. So the way in which we are advocating that this could be not completely resolved, but certainly one of the steps to resolving it is by replacing these elected representatives on the right with people that look more like the graph on the left. And we can do this through sortition, random selection. So this was actually a slide that was made for a council, but it works at whichever level you want to look at. The idea would be to have a deliberative mini public. So the first step is you decide to, ideally you would have a standing body which is in place of elected officials. The way that I see this working in a practical sense is that we're starting with local governments, which is why this slide is actually referring to councils, replacing the second chambers, such as the House of Lords in the UK, the Senate here in Australia, the Dewan Negara in Malaysia. These are all the countries that I'm most familiar with. And replacing them with a randomly selected assembly, and in the long run, hopefully replacing the first legislative chamber with a standing citizens assembly as well. So you first of all decide that this is the process that you're going to do. The second is a two-step stratified random selection. Now, to explain how this works, and as I say, we'll be doing an exercise a bit later on. For the UK Climate Assembly, which is one of the biggest that Sortition Foundation has been involved in, we needed to recruit 110 people who looked like the population of the UK. So who looked a bit like this graph on the left here, but also not just in terms of gender and age. We also wanted to look at geography. We also wanted to look at their attitudes on climate change, so that people who were not at all concerned about climate change were also represented in the Climate Assembly, and also looking at indicators for socioeconomic status. So in the UK, they have these things called indices of multiple deprivation, which basically map poor and rich areas. So they can use that as a way to tell that they're getting a group that looks like the population in terms of income and education levels, basically, socioeconomic indicators. So to do that, 30,000 invitations were sent out across the country. And the addresses that they were sent to were picked at random from the UK Royal Mail database. So anybody that lived in somewhere that had an address attached to it, a residential address attached to it, could get chosen. Now, obviously, that means that there are people who were less likely to get an invitation. Obviously, the homeless were less likely to get an invitation. People who live in like university accommodation and things like that were less likely to get an invitation. But we are developing strategies for doing that. So, for example, we're developing relationships in the UK with homeless shelters so that we can include them as people that we send invitations to, so that we can include some of the people that earlier on we weren't able to get. So we're learning as we're doing these things. So you send out 30,000 invitations, and anybody that's at those residential addresses can register to be a member of the assembly. So out of those 30,000, we got, I think it was about 2,000 respondents. So that means we've got a pool of 2,000 people that we can choose the 110 respondents from. Now, obviously, there is bias within that pool. You do tend to get people who are richer, tend to respond more. There is often a gender bias in who responds, and that seems to depend a bit on the question. Often you get more women, but one that I was doing recently, oddly enough, was more men, which was about water. You tend to get more older people and fewer younger people. So that's why the second step is really important. And the second step chooses, again, out of those 2,000 people, it chooses the 110 people, but it makes sure that they are representative along all the demographics that have been selected as being important. So as I was mentioning, age, gender, geography, income range, all of those sorts of things, they have to be representative along those lines. And we've got a clever piece of software that does that. The third thing is the actual Citizens Assembly. Now, there have been Citizens Assemblies held in a number of countries around the world. There's been Citizens Assemblies. The first ones were in 2004, the first ones in recent times, and that are sort of recognized as being government-led Citizens Assemblies, were held in 2004 in Canada. And they were primarily interested in the issue of electoral reform. So they held, it was in British Columbia, and they held a Citizens Assembly where they chose basically one man and one woman from each of the electoral districts within the province. And they came together to discuss what's really quite complex political theory stuff on how to reform the electoral system, whether to use a first past the post system, proportional representation, what forms of proportional representation, that sort of thing. And one of the really important things that came out of that was that ordinary people could make difficult decisions. It didn't matter about their level of education, as long as there were people there that were willing to spend the time, the experts, to provide them with the information, that they had time to deliberate and discuss the ideas together, and that they felt supported through that process, then they could take this really complex information, deconstruct it, and come up with their own ideas about how they thought that the electoral system should be reshaped. The second thing that happened with the Canadian experience in 2004 was it really showed the power of the Citizens Assembly, not just in terms of the ability of ordinary people to make the decision, but that the majority of people who understood the process, and that's quite important, that they understood the process, supported the process, even when the decisions were not the decisions that those people would have made. So rather than, when you think about the party political systems that we have at the moment, the whole system is set up to be divisive. It's either you support me and my team, or you support you and the other team. And because of the way it's set up, this team has to say that everything that this team stands for is bad, and vice versa. There is little incentive to be seen to cooperate. Now, there is a lot more cooperation than we see that takes place behind the scenes, obviously. But it is in their interests to pretend that doesn't actually happen. So it leads to greater division and divisiveness across society. Whereas with this model, what happens is the people once people understand the process, even when they don't agree with it, because it's not set up as oppositional, and it's set up as a group of ordinary people trying to come up with the best decisions, you find that there's a lot more support for the decisions that were made. Unfortunately, in the Canadian process, what they found was all those that understood the process, something like 75% of them supported the recommendations, but the process wasn't very well explained through the media, and they were given a really high hurdle to pass before the recommendations became law. So they didn't actually work in that sense. They didn't become law because they had to get 2/3 support in a referendum, which was just a really high hurdle. So the process is process of deliberation, being informed by experts who are chosen by a body which is seen to be neutral by at least the party political elites, and coming to public judgment. So this is different from the public opinion that we see in the papers all the time, which the public opinion surveys and things are on the spot right now. What do you think about this issue? And often those issues are ones which have been in the headlines and reduced to sort of catchphrases, reduced to the sloganeering, and made into divisive issues by the party political process. Public judgment is informed, and it's after the process of deliberation where you have to think about the perspectives of other people. So the really important question to be asking during this process of deliberation is, why do you hold the views that you hold, and what would it take for you to shift on those views? And that is what a good deliberative process does. Now, it's clear that these processes can happen well or they can happen badly. But generally, they seem to be done in a genuine fashion. People are really trying, when they have been done, to get to be neutral about things and to get to what the public actually is, what public judgment actually is. And I think that's important to just have as a sort of caveat. Right, so why we at Sortition Foundation, why we're called Sortition Foundation, why do we think that sortition is better than sending out invites and or public consultation processes and things like that, which are already used in conjunction with elected legislators? One of the problems is, I mean, this is the problem with political lobbying, really, is that the same voices get heard all the time. Even on a local council level, you have people like me who have a view on everything and make sure that your elected officials know what your view on things is. And those people are, I still think, very important in some ways. But they are the loudest voices in the room, not the average voices in the room. So when you have an invitation system where you're inviting people who wouldn't necessarily speak out otherwise will put themselves forward. And also you get a mini public that looks like the average public, which is what I've spent quite a lot of time on already, I think. So moving on. I've talked about the two-step random selection. So I can talk a lot more about other case studies and things if you want to, but I thought that I would stop there, going through the process like that. There have been really successful citizens assemblies in Ireland that has probably been one of the best examples of putting the recommendations of citizens assemblies into practice. There have also been in Poland some in the city of Gdansk. They've done some exciting stuff with citizens assembly. And in Belgium, they have, in the eastern Belgium, they have instituted a standing citizens assembly to advise elected legislators. So 25 people who are randomly selected, who meet 3 times a year, give or take. They haven't met yet because of coronavirus. It was supposed to start this year, but everything being up in the air as it is, I don't think they have actually met yet. They hadn't when I last looked at it a couple of months ago. But they are now part of that legislative process. And they were basically given as much power as the local assembly could give them without changing the constitution, which I think is quite cool. So I'm going to stop sharing this and have a brief look at how the sortition, what it actually looks like. So I have 2 things here. I assume you can all see what I've got. I've got 2 buckets here. In these 2 buckets together are all your names with the genders you've identified by and your favorite primary colors. So I'm going to select for a citizens assembly of 9 people. Now, these 9 people, there's going to be, as you can see across the top here, a maximum of 5 who identified as male, a maximum of 5 who identified as female. And this is where you get the idea of how the sortition works. A maximum of 3 people whose favorite primary color is red, favorite primary color yellow, and favorite primary color blue. Now, you might ask why I've done 2 different containers rather than just 1. When I was preparing this, I noticed that hardly anybody liked yellow. There were very, very few people who liked yellow as their favorite primary color. So all the people who like yellow are here in this cup. And I'm going to draw from this cup first so that we can meet the totals on yellow, and then choose from the bigger container to get the red and the blue. So, and this is pretty much how the software works as well. It sees which is the hardest thing to get to meet the targets on and chooses from them first. So I'm now going to choose who's going to sit in our fictional Citizens Assembly. So you can see, if we were doing this face-to-face, I would get each of you to pick out a name from the hat. But seeing as we're on Zoom, I'm afraid I have to do it. So the first person is, I don't know if you can read that, Sanjana. So I'll put Sanjana's name down the bottom here, not that it really matters. And Sanjana is female, and her favorite color is yellow of the 3 primary colors. Now we'll pick somebody else. And this is Banashri. I hope I pronounced that right. And they are also female, whose favorite color is yellow. So we'll change that to a 2 and put your name here. That's spelled right. And now the third person is Rupesh, who is male and whose favorite primary color is yellow. So now we have all of our yellows there. So now I'm going to put all of them aside and just pick from the bigger container. So you'll notice that you obviously had a better chance of being selected if your favorite primary color was yellow. In real life, it would be you would have a better chance of being selected if you were younger, because younger people are less likely to register. Or if you were poorer, you'd be more likely to be selected because fewer people who are poorer register. So there is a real life implications to this, but it makes it more representative and more fair. So now we have Andrea, whose favorite color is red. So let's put Andrea there. Now you'll notice we've filled up the total there on yellow. We've got 3 women and 1 man. So we can have a maximum of 2 more people who identify as female. So here we have Javneet, who is male and whose favorite color is blue. We now have 2 guys. There were a lot more women in this group than men. So the men have a better chance of being selected as individuals than the women do. So Rishabh is male and blue. Oh, I've got 2. I've got Manas, who is male and blue. So now we've got all of our blues as well. So we only can get people whose favorite color is red. So now if I pick out a name that is Kuba, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. Your favorite color is blue. So I'm afraid even though you've been picked out, you're discarded and you're not part of it. Who have we got here? Now we've got Aditya, who is male and whose favorite color is red. And now we've got 5 men. So we can't have any more males and we can't have any more blues, and we can't. So we're looking for that 1 more person who is female and red. So let me put Aditya's name there. So whoever I pick now, unless they are, so Jasjeet is male and favorite color red, but too bad. And Misha, whose favorite color is blue, female, but too bad. Now the software that we have does this in about a minute, which is great. Chinmaya, female, blue. It's a lot more fun when I can get other people to do this with me. Asif, male, red. Kartika, female, blue. I'm sure that there's still more women. Aham, female, blue. Oh dear. Ishita, female, blue. I've still got plenty of names in here. Ishan, male, red. Leonard, male, blue. Aditi, female, blue. Ayush, male, red. Oh dear. Crystal, female, blue. Samath, male, red. Maybe we don't have any female reds here. Inayat, female, red. Female, blue, Maskan. Ah, finally, Shripana, female, red. Hooray! We have met all of our targets. And we've got that last person there. And we have all 9 of the people for our Citizens Assembly. So that's how it could be done. You can see that there are the possibilities that we wouldn't meet all the targets. So that's why we try to send out so many invitations and get so many responses. So we've got a minimum number of people, even in the hard to reach categories, or the categories we find hard to reach. I shall stop sharing now and move over to discussion. Shripana saves the day. Yes, thank you.
No, I think at least from my side, they're very, very useful. Anyone has questions, please do raise your hand and we'll put you on. But just to kick things off, Sonia, one of my major concerns, you know, even when I was reading and when I heard one of your talks previously as well, is at least when I see in India, you know, this group is indicative also, right? The people who would want to perhaps, and maybe it's just a figment of my imagination, but the people who would want to perhaps participate in something of this sort would invariably be the people who are, to say the least, disgruntled with the current system of decision making, right? So if we are asking them to submit their time and effort, whatever time at the very least, towards these citizen assemblies and discussing the things that are relevant and so on and so forth, how do we ensure that the same kind of bias that perhaps exists in certain governments doesn't end up coming here, because those who would be interested would be the first people who would effectively want to participate in something of this sort?
Sure. So one of the things is you don't get to decide. You have to be invited. And I think that makes a big difference, because it means that people who wouldn't necessarily put their hand up for things are, when you're told, your voice matters, your opinion matters, we want to hear from you, regardless of what your opinion is, regardless of what your background is, then people are more likely to step forward, even if they aren't disgruntled and they don't have, even if when they don't have a point of view. So on the Irish Citizens Assembly on aged care, you found that some of the people in the room were saying, this is something I've never really thought about before, but I'm interested in learning more about the issue. And that was partly why they took part in it, was to learn more about the issue. And I think that that way of phrasing it, as in your opinion matters, we want to hear from you, is one powerful way. The second thing is, of course, people's time has to be remunerated. There has to be a way of making sure that people who have other responsibilities, whether it's, you know, childcare, elder care, getting things in from fields type of things, whatever it is, that's all taken into consideration and accounted for in a monetary sense as well as anything else. So people, so for example, in the UK Citizens Assemblies, if you are unemployed and on benefits in the UK, then if you get money, it can jeopardize your ability to continue benefits. So they offer vouchers and in-kind payment for people on benefits, so that takes into account that they still get remunerated, because they're the people most in need of remuneration, without it jeopardizing their income as well. So those are things to be sensitive of, to try and make sure that as many people as possible feel that the space is welcoming to them. And that also can apply to things like making it accessible in terms of disabilities, in terms of language, and all those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, no, I think what I take from that is just reaching out, right? So once you do reach out, then invariably you will get people to step up, even if they hold a contrarian view or whatever it may be, but it's still a place for them to get heard. We've got a question from Kuber on chat as well, right? Which is probably something that's, again, it's important because it talks about validation, Sonia, is and it probably comes from a place saying that if it has to be meaningful, it'll probably require some sort of validation, from the government and so on and so forth. And if creating such assemblies which actually have that validation in place requires a legislation from the government, what incentive does the government have to validate any of this, right? Because we've got a lot and protests happen all the time, right? That's our way of a citizen assembly in that sense, right? Not the most structured, and that's the reason why a lot of protests end up meeting with at least allegations of not being fair and so on and so forth. But what incentive could the government possibly have to listen to these citizen assemblies, let alone give them the validation that perhaps would be required?
So I think it's a great question. And it's really, how do we get from here to there? How do we actually move things along in some ways? So the way it has required a crisis in almost every country that has had citizens assemblies. So for example, in Canada, the one that I mentioned earlier, it was a crisis of that was seen as a bipartisan issue, a crisis of democracy itself. People were losing faith in the idea of democracy. And I think that's a fairly common concern across the world at the moment, is that people are losing faith in democracy. There was a survey that came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago from the European Union, and young Europeans, 53% of them believe that they would support authoritarianism if it handled the climate crisis. And only 47% felt that democracy was an important value in the context of the climate crisis. So I think that there are really important reasons why people who are in elected legislatures might choose to institute at least one-off citizens' assemblies. The places, so the Gdansk was another one I mentioned. There was a massive floods, and that was why the mayor of Gdansk instituted a citizens assembly and agreed beforehand to implement any of the recommendations that got more than 80% support within the assembly. So that was a fairly powerful measure. The reason why they instituted a standing citizens assembly in East Belgium was, again, this crisis of democracy. Elected democracy was not seen as being able to form effective government in Belgium. There had been a crisis of democracy and a parallel process run by citizens to constitute a people's assembly, which was seen as having more legitimacy than the elected representatives. And that's why they decided to institute a standing citizens assembly. And they're also often seen, again, as one-offs, as ways in which politicians can sort of outsource complex decision-making to other people. And there is a problem with that, of course, in that all the hardest issues get put towards citizens' assemblies, whereas the easy things, which could be easy wins, the elected officials handle. So that's slightly problematic. But I do think that the more that people experience them, the greater the clamour becomes to have them. And that certainly seems to be the case in the UK, where it's just been a rolling ball effect. We're currently, I think there's about 7 citizens' assemblies right now that we, Sortition Foundation, are involved in organising, compared to none this time last year.
No, understood. And I think I agree with you. I think it's more about getting it done. It's more about finding the right opportunities to try and get that voice out there as well, because find the time when they will listen, because of frankly speaking, and I'd probably put it this way, that for their own political reasons also, right? So there may be times when it is in their political best interest to listen to citizen assemblies, and that's when you actually push through, because they do need your support or whatever it may be. But once you're in, that's when you need to do things the right way. That's basically at least what I get from this conversation. So Ishan's typed out his question, right? And I think it's a question that came to my head as well on many occasions, not in this context, but in a very different context when we talk about equality as part of our foundation, right? Is by trying to be representative, right? And as what you mentioned, would there be a possibility that we break out into even more groups than currently exist? right? Because how much can you actually break down? Because there will, again, as he mentions, there would be more Black women in politics, so there could be more Black Muslim women in politics, Black Muslim women above the age of 60. Again, how many groups can you actually create and then cater to in a process like this? And when do you actually stop?
I think that's a really great question, the question of the census, right? Now, one of the things that we advocate for is that we only try to stratify along those criteria which are otherwise underrepresented in the response rates. So that is why we have actively advocated against, for example, having sexuality as a criteria for sortition, because there is no evidence at all to indicate that people who are LGBTIQ are underrepresented in the responses that we get. So there is no reason why they should be underrepresented in a random sample. In contrast, as our little experiment showed, the people who like yellow were underrepresented. So in theory, perhaps you should have a third of the people, let's say, a third of the population would have yellow as their favorite primary color. And we've had a census poll that shows that a third of people like yellow as their favorite primary color. But for some reason, because people who have yellow as a favorite primary color are less likely to want to engage in a citizens assembly, maybe because of peer pressures, whatever it is. So the real life thing is young people are less likely to actually be there. So therefore, age is a criteria that we should select against. And that way you don't have the problem of creating divisions which aren't necessarily sort of discriminated against by the process. So that's how we've been handling it. So we try to choose those divisions where we can see that there is underrepresentation.
So, so no, what I hear from that is that I think, and Ishan, to your question, it's not really about choosing those sections that are discriminated in society in that sense. It's by the system, because there's a system in place. Will that system give you adequate representation or not if you did not make special provisions for a certain set of people? That's really where the question lies, right? Because, and that could be because of some of the reasons that Sonia mentioned right in the beginning, that the homeless, for example, right? The system would not cater to the homeless unless you made special provisions because of addresses and them responding and so on and so forth, right? And that's really, yes, please.
And one other thing is, and it can also depend upon what the question is and things as well. So for example, there was one that we did on accessibility in transport, where there was a decision made to overrepresent people with a disability within the sample, within the mini public, because people with a disability are disproportionately affected by issues of accessibility in public transport. And the important thing is, if you're going to bias it one way or another, like in that example, you have to be able to defend that to the public to ensure that it retains legitimacy. And that's the key thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and it may also have to change as and when the circumstances change or whatever it may be. So let's move on to Inayat's question on chat, which is also something that I briefly mentioned earlier as well, is if this actually becomes popular, right? If the whole concept of citizen assemblies becomes popular, and while you already answered that it is still based on an invitation that you receive, so that the chances of bias then reduce because you're receiving an invitation instead of raising your hand, right? But still, once it becomes popular, once they've been selected, once they get into a part of the assembly, the whole idea of manipulation by political parties, by those in power, by those who are trying to influence them, how do we try and prevent that? How do we, because right now they don't have their focus on this. The moment they realize something of this sort is happening, and even if we get the selection down perfectly, right? Even then there will be still a gap of say a month, 2 months, 1 week, 2 days, whatever it is, a time span during which they can get influenced by these political parties. And then that will perhaps give them more validation to what they end up doing, because they get validation from here as well. Is there any, yeah.
I think that there are a few different components to this. So I'm going to take the easiest bit first. The easiest bit is that you don't, so in an elected process, right from the moment you declare yourself as a candidate, you need to be raising funds for your election campaign. And election campaigns are increasingly expensive everywhere in the world. And so you are already beholden to corporate interests from the moment you start running a campaign, just about. And obviously there are some exceptions, but it's a lot harder to get elected. And so the majority of people who get elected are going to be beholden to corporate interests from the get-go. The second thing is that the party political system itself, once you've got the hierarchy of a party political system, there are people within that hierarchy who are disproportionately influential and people who are less influential. And if you can influence the smaller number of people at the top of the system, you don't need to worry so much about the people lower down in the system, as it were, even if they're members of parliament. So it's much easier to direct your influence at the decision makers within the party system. Whereas if you have the same number of people who none of them are joined together in as formal groupings, at least not from the outset, it becomes much harder. There aren't those hierarchies formed. And because you're not, I mean, if you think about the way that parliaments are constructed, I don't actually know what the Indian parliament looks like internally, but I know that certainly Westminster, the Australian parliament, the Malaysian parliament, it's two sides of a chamber sitting opposite each other in sort of antagonism right from the architecture of the way that the assembly is held. Whereas if you've got people on small tables that sit together for a while and then move and swap and have different people sitting on the tables at different times, it becomes much harder to formalize those hierarchies within that system. The third thing is that unlike with elected representatives, there isn't the same need for the people who are chosen to have publicity and to have media coverage and things like that. It's not a popularity contest to become elected. And I think that changes the dynamic as well. And I think that one of the really interesting examples of this is there was a guy called Ricky Muir. Ricky Muir was running for a Senate seat in Victoria. And because of the way that the right tried to manipulate the system here, he was in the and car enthusiasts party, I think it was something like that. It was a bizarre little micro party that probably has about 5 members. And he got elected because of the way the preference system in Victoria works. And because ordinary person, there was a video of him throwing kangaroo poo at his brother available on YouTube. He had not really thought that he was going to have a political career, I don't think. Otherwise you would have taken down those YouTube videos long before you got elected. He did remarkably well. I was like, oh my God, what's he going to be like? But the decisions that he made, because he has to go back, he's never going to have a second term. He's never going to be mixing with the people in Parliament ever again, except for this short term that he's sitting. His real community, the real people he'll have to explain the decisions he makes to, are the people in his community. That's where he will live the rest of his life. And so he's actually made, for somebody who had hardly any education, I mean, compared to the majority of people in the Senate, and that poor educational background, lower socioeconomic status, no experience of politics whatsoever, made fairly good political judgments, in my opinion, not the ones that he was being pressured to make by the parties and by the system. The rationale he gave was because he's an ordinary bloke and he has to face up to ordinary people like him when he explains his decisions. So I think that those are powerful reasons why it's harder to play the system when it's randomly selected people.
Yeah, and to add to that, as compared to a bipartisan system or even a tripartisan system, instead of having to just speak to or influence the leader of the opposition or the person, whoever party in power, you now need to look at so many people, right? So your effort also increases because everyone's an independent effectively in that sense, yeah. Right? Last part of what you said also addressed the question that the follow-up question that Ishan had in terms of, perhaps this sort of a model makes it less effective, or because of less competent people coming in into the system. But I think you addressed that already, because at the end of the day, and what I would add to that is that there's a distinction between those who represent and those who administer, right? So for example, even in India, you have the Indian Administrative Services, who are the experts, who have the education to move on and give the kind of advice that is required for the country to move forward. But in terms of those who are representing the people, if they are the people themselves, right, that delta really doesn't arise in that particular situation effectively, at least in my mind. But yes, Ayush, you've raised your hand. Sorry, I didn't see that before I asked the last question. So please do unmute yourself.
Yeah, that's all right. So yeah, it has certainly been really informative. The question that I have is basically quite India-centric, not maybe probably global, which is that the Indian system of governance does not have a prerequisite level of education for, say, people who will be representing the other people or the masses. So when you say that you choose people at random, they can be anyone. So I have a two-part question. The first is, do you yourself, and this is not something that you probably put in the software that would sort it, but do you yourself have a prerequisite? Because when we talk about India, the literacy is somewhere around 74, 75, and that to the basic, where people can just read and write or understand simple. While Ireland and Canada that you talk about are way ahead with 99, 95%. So is there a prerequisite according to you that stands for a population that is like India? And secondly, if not, you said that there are experts who can help them. And even Ramit just now talked about the civil services being there. But we've seen that this bureaucracy with politicians having no education has been one of the backhands that has been twisting the whole system at its forefront. So where do you see that this nexus could not be a backhand for the current political systems, which later found this system to be very important? How do you assess these two factors?
It's a great question. A little bit of my background. One of the most politically astute people I have ever known was my grandmother. She passed away about 5 years ago. She's Punjabi in origin. She was born in Malaysia, but she couldn't read or write anything. She was completely illiterate, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't politically astute. She knew which political party she wanted to vote for, and she found that through discussions with her friends and discussions with the neighbors and talking to people and keeping an eye on things, and also being really stubborn about everything. So I don't think that so in my personal experience, I don't think so, but also some of the interesting examples of participatory democracy. So this is moving beyond just the narrow focus of Citizens Assemblies, is participatory budgeting. Now, participatory budgeting, one of the biggest exercises in participatory budgeting happens in Porto Alegre. And there is I can't remember what the percentage is now, but a large proportion of the municipalities, the city's budget, is decided through participatory budgeting processes. Now, the majority of people there are uneducated and poor, and they have a process of deliberation which involves thousands of people, 20,000 people on average, to help decide how to spend that money. So people know. I have, despite everything that we see around us today, I still have faith in people. I think that the majority of people will try to do the right thing. And one of the citizens' assemblies that was held here in Victoria was actually on development and what the regulations should be in a particular municipality about development. One of the people in the room that was chosen at random happened to be one of the biggest developers in the area. And yet when he came into the room and was told, look, you're deciding this for the community, the organizers the people that I got this information from, were really quite worried about his role in trying to pervert it so that he would be protecting his own business interests. But he was actually really constructive as a presence in the room. And while he was obviously putting forward a more pro-business argument than other people might have done, it wasn't that he was protecting his interests. He put them forward in a pro-community kind of way. So there's that. The second question, and I really do feel you on this one in terms of the bureaucracy in India, I think there has to be a recognition that there are things that changes to this process can do, and things which are beyond what can be done just through changes to the government, the way that government and legislative processes are set up. I think that to tackle the morass that is the Indian bureaucracy, it's going to be a long haul process that's going to require a community-wide, nationwide effort that not citizens' assemblies on their own cannot be expected. I think that they're part of the puzzle, perhaps, but I think that it's a huge problem, and it's going to be a multi-pronged approach that's needed to handle it. I have no easy answers on that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but just to add on to the point that you made about the developer not really side railing that entire process over there. I think what also ends up happening, and perhaps some of us in the room also are familiar with this, is that if in your own family, right, or with people around you, when you're in your own community, and you alluded to this a little bit, Sonia, previously as well, you would invariably want to say the right thing, right? Because even if in your business you're cheating people of their provident funds and so on and so forth, and you're doing all the wrong in the world, when it comes to public perception, when it comes to being faced by people who you're going to be walking down the road and seeing, or you know that there's going to be some sort of a contact, or they may know someone that you know, or whatever else. At that point in time, I don't think that you're going to openly say that, oh, guess what, stealing people's provident funds is correct and I want to continue to do that, right? So it's also about that peer group that ends up getting created in a model like this, which can help, if not completely do away with biases, but make people just question how they want to be perceived going forward as well, which may, one way or the other, it may not be the truth, but one way or the other makes them start thinking more sensibly and then reacting and responding more sensibly as well. And to Karthika's question, I think this covers a bit of what she mentioned as well, where she basically said that, you know, in India, people are more worried about making their ends meet, right? And I'm paraphrasing now, but more interested in trying to make sure that they can live a happy life, because they feel that they're very distant from this whole decision-making process. And what is relevant really is for me to be able to get my next job, to find a school for my kid, and so on and so forth. In a system like that, how do you really get people to start talking, right? Because and saying that, okay, no, you have your life, but this is also important for you. And the example that she gives, I think, is pretty apt, because we had a jury system in India as well at a point of time, right? And there are many more reasons why it went away, not necessarily because of the fact that people weren't interested, but it still went away, right? It's not something that anyone's asked to bring back as a form of a justice system. Like, again, not openly at the very least, right? So in that, how do you really get people excited about this? And I'm sorry, I'm probably just going to plug in another angle to this, Sonia. But how do you get them excited? And in order to get them excited, do you really start with questions that are, you know, that are very popular, or do you start with questions that actually matter to me? Right? Because usually those things are different, because what the media would popularize, that's where you'll get the traction, and then you'll get people attracted. But things that really matter, not necessarily. So how do you really go about this entire process, if you have any thoughts on that?
I'm a bit of a Tocquevillian in this regard. I think democracy starts from the grassroots. And I think that that's where it builds its power, because when you're doing village level democracy, local council level democracy, that's when you can see that those decisions make an impact in your life. So in my other life as a media freedom activist, I was very inspired by the right to information movement in India, where you got your right to information law by people going down to villages and showing people how the documents that weren't being made available to them were impacting their lives, how they hadn't been paid for work that they were down as having done. They hadn't done the work, but that somebody had collected their salaries on their behalf. That they had been entitled to have a road going through. The document said the road had been built, but there was no road anywhere near where they were. So making those, bringing the relevance of the lack of information into people's lives, into their geography, and so I do think that with any sort of democratic processes, it always starts at the bottom up. Otherwise, you get very fragile systems. I think this is one of the problems with a lot of post-colonial democracies, is that it was a top-down process that was imposed upon us rather than a bottom-up process that we chose for ourselves, certainly from a Malaysian perspective at any rate. I could go on about this for days, but I won't bore you. So I do think that you need to have that, that any type of democracy starts sort of in the home, in the area that you can see and live and feel and taste the decisions that are being made by you and your fellow villagers, fellow city members, whatever it is. And then, but the paradox there is that you need to have the publicity for these processes for them to catch on. And that's something that we're really feeling here in Australia, where there have been citizens' assemblies being held here since 2009, and nobody knows about them. And they're like, oh, what a radical new invention this Citizens' Assembly is. And it's like, we've been doing them here for 11 years and nobody realizes it. So there is an important piece of the puzzle for the advocacy work of getting the publicity as well. But I think that unless you have it from the bottom up, it just all falls down. Everything starts from the foundations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's and that's with any kind of cause that you're looking at, right? Because if you immediately try and get to your end result in step one, you won't have a foundation to stand on. That's how buildings fall and crumble at the end of the day, right? Okay, so another question we've got here from Samarth, right? A little earlier, and I didn't pick it up then, is when you've got these different levels of citizen assemblies, right? So for example, you may have a citizen assembly for 2 communities, right? 2 housing communities, let's assume. And then you probably have one which actually include both of them together, and versus another set of 2 communities or whatever it may be. Objectives will keep changing, right? Because and this classically happens, and I'm just using an example, then we see how we fit it in. It classically happens in India, at least in interstate issues with respect to water. Water is one of the biggest issues in India, right? Where one says that the river flows through 2 states, and then one state ends up blocking out that water because that's what's good for their citizens as compared to the others. So when you're really having that sort of a model, without having a government in the center to decide and decide on these kind of issues, how do we, have you thought about how these citizen assemblies can actually be more meaningful and more inclusive, even if those particular members are not part of the assembly at that point in time?
I think that there's 2, so I'm again moving a little bit outside the Citizens Assembly thing and looking again at the participatory budgeting, because that is really very much about where do the resources go. And you find that, so the way that the Porto Alegre system works is you've got these, it's very much a sort of filtering from the bottom up. So decisions made within smaller areas that are then filtered up to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. So all the decisions start at the bottom, but they get filtered up. But the thing is, people are putting in the ideas and they understand how the process works. And so they recognize the legitimacy, even if they don't get the funds for the things that they wanted to have in their community. So I think that's one side of it, is that you can, if there is an understanding of the process and how the process works, that helps to build legitimacy in the decisions which are made, even when you don't get the stuff that you want and the decisions that you want. Where I am right now here in Australia is the constituency, the local council is called Darebin, and it's a local council that encompasses some fairly poor areas further north from where I am and fairly well-off areas to the south of where I am. I'm right on the sort of borderline between the two, closer to the poorer areas. and they had a Citizens Assembly to decide certain aspects of the council budget and where in particular the budget should be spent. And what you found was the people that advocated most for the poorer areas were the people from the richer areas and the people from the poorer areas. So it was a good way of seeing that people will advocate against their own self-interest if the process is set up well. And as I say, that's not bound to happen, but it does happen, that people will advocate for things which they think of as being good for the community if you can set it up that you're entering the space as a representative of the community and trying to find what's in the best interest of all. It's not that, and that it really is saying that seems to help to shift people into the mindset. It's not like you have to do a long process. Say, we're here to work out the best decisions for our community. And people will often take that on board as what they're there to do. So it's a way, again, of seeing them as shared resources that need to be treated fairly, rather than seeing that if I win this battle, then I get, the status of having won this battle. And so reframing it from a battle over water to a consensus decision-making process. And I know that makes it sound like, I don't want to gloss over the difficulties that are there, because I know that these are very real, very difficult issues. But I think that where it's set up as a battle, it becomes impossible to do anything but see it as a zero-sum game. Whereas if we set it up to try and find solutions in the best interests of everyone, we're far more likely to get better outcomes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know we've crossed the hour mark, Sonia, but if it's okay with you, if we can stick around for another
Sure.
few minutes.
I just better warn you that I do have 2 children and I don't know how much longer I can keep them out.
No worries. No, so just a couple of really quick questions. One, probably when I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you this question, that in a country, and because the alternate is a referendum, right? That's really something that one keeps looking at in terms of getting citizens to be involved via a referendum. And in countries where a referendum is actually possible, right? Maybe not in a country like India, because it is as massive as it is. Maybe not even in Australia in that sense, if you look at the entire country, because of how widespread it is and so on and so forth. But where it's possible, what would your suggestion be? A sortition exercise, a citizen assembly, or a referendum? Between the two, when it's actually possible to do both?
So I think the problem with the referendum is it's a really blunt instrument, and it's being increasingly used for really complex issues. I mean, the archetype of this was Brexit. The idea of leaving the European Union is such a complicated issue, and it involves so many different facets and things like that. And it was so badly communicated to the public, and people just basically lying to get the votes on particularly the Leave side. It's a really blunt instrument, and it shouldn't be used for complicated issues. The other thing, of course, is there was the referendum here in Australia over same-sex marriage, and it was overwhelmingly in favor of same-sex marriage. But every opinion poll before that had shown that the public was overwhelmingly in favor of same-sex marriage, and it just seemed to be an excuse to demonize people and to air really homophobic views. So there are some real issues with referendums. Now, obviously, the referendums that have taken place as a result of Citizens Assembly have been where there have been constitutional changes required. And what's been interesting about those is that they have generally confirmed that the Citizens Assembly was reflective of informed public judgment. So, for example, the starkest one was the Irish Citizens Assembly on abortion. Immediately after the Citizens Assembly had put forward their recommendations and things like that, the journalists were saying that the elected legislators, did not believe that the Irish public was ready for that sort of change, that the public would never support the repeal of Article 8 in a referendum. And of course, the vote in the referendum was actually slightly higher in favor of repeal it was 66.7 as opposed to 66%, something. I mean, it was very minimal, the difference, but more people in the referendum supported repeal of the article, which, what's the word? Sorry, I can't think of it, which made abortion illegal there. So I think that, I certainly think that citizens' assemblies are a much more nuanced instrument than a referendum is. And I think referendums should be treated with extreme caution, because they can be very divisive and can really, as I say, from my experience with the same-sex marriage one here, can be really harmful in the way that the questions are posed. The rights, especially when it's to do with the fundamental rights of people who are already marginalized.
No, absolutely, and I get that distinction, and I think agree to a large extent as well as, and that's what we keep saying at the project and at the foundation as well, is that let's not try and oversimplify things that are complicated. If they're complicated, accept the fact that they're complicated and put in the effort that you need to actually put in the effort to find your position. No, so before we let you go back to your kids, the last question that I do have to ask you is with respect to just fairness and being fair, right? This entire process is predicated on that, in that sense, and we are the FAIR project. So, in your eyes, what is fairness for you? What do you think constitutes being fair? And just in all the work that you've been doing in your life generally.
Gosh, that's an excellent question. I think that I'm taking a fairly Rawlsian position, that a fair outcome is one where you don't mind which side you are on once the decision has been made, in a way. So what I mean is, like, I'm thinking, sorry, my kids were fighting just then and I could hear that they're arguing over something. So it's fair if either side will agree that the outcome. And I think that I'm being overly influenced by my immediate surroundings. But yes, it's a very Rawlsian answer, in that idea of the veil of ignorance, where you set out what the different positions are, so you don't mind being in any of those positions after you find out where you're going to land. I don't think that's a bad answer to what fairness is. I know there are lots of problems with the Rawlsian perspective and things, but I still think that's not a bad idea of what fairness is.
No, thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for all your time and walking us through this entire process. I think there's a lot that I definitely am going to be thinking about, and hopefully others on this call as well. And yeah, all the very best for everything that you're doing. From our side, I think this is fantastic. I think the more that, and I know how much work all of you are doing in every place that you're involved in, but the more that all of you keep doing, and the more people, perhaps someone from this group stands up and says that, this is something that I want to contribute towards as well, and this is something that I want to propagate as well, I think it'll be better for all of us all over the planet. So
and if anybody would like to, my email address, Ramit and Shivana have it, so please do feel free. I would happy to help you to make these things a reality where you are and stuff like that. Or we're working at the moment, we're trying to work with schools, we're working with universities. We think that they are tools that can be used in businesses. So anywhere that you think that there is the potential for more participatory deliberative decision making, happy to discuss it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and yeah, have a lovely rest of the day and a lovely weekend to come. And yeah, thank you so much.
Same to all of you. Thank you very much for your time, for your questions, and have a lovely weekend.
Bye.
Bye.